Hi, we enter into Genesis 34 today after the two videos both introducing this whole unit from 33:17 through the end of chapter 35, and also the four introductory verses from 33:17 to 20 that we looked at in the last video to give shape to where we are, as you can see on the right side of the screen, at the bottom of the Jacob and Esau section here, matching the beginning of it as we saw up there. So if you haven't watched the introductory video, I really encourage you to do it, where we go over in detail some of these issues that face interpreters of Genesis 34. And as I said in the intro in the last video, it's so key, as I understand it, to pay attention to the larger picture, as I've been noting here. This framework up here, that's what we looked at in the last video, 33:17 to 20, where all the parts that are black underlined match the parts down here that are from 35:1 to 7. And my point is that these specific words, which are almost not anywhere else other than these places, and certainly not in this combination other than these two places, are highlighting that we shouldn't be reading Genesis 34 apart from that frame. And as we saw last time, one of the key aspects of the frame was that Jacob is settled too soon. He was supposed to keep his vow to return to his father's home, and he had said in 33:18 that he's going to see his father Isaac. And yet, as we'll see, we don't see it down here. It'll happen in chapter 35 after this. But we'll also see on the flip side of the framework here that as they journeyed and left behind this scene, a terror from God fell upon the cities all around them, highlighting that the cities are the theme all along. Not intermarriage, not foreignness, but the danger of cities. And so Jacob is supposed to avoid these kinds of cities, as we've seen throughout Genesis, starting with Cain's city. Similarly here, named after his son Enoch, the city Enoch and the son Enoch, here we have the city Shechem and the son Shechem, which ought to be an echo among the many echoes that we've seen in the introductory video in chapter 34 that echo earlier parts of Genesis, to highlight that we can only read this not only in the immediate narrative context of these surrounding frames, but in the entire context of the story of Genesis, which highlights that in Genesis the issue has never been foreignness, but the issue has been a kind of organization of the socio-economic theological order, where there are people on top and people at the bottom, defended by violence, and often in the material form of a city, with a wall and a gate that shields insiders from outsiders, as we saw specifically in the Sodom story in chapter 19. So those are some of the themes we looked at in the introductory video, and today we're going to begin in these first verses here in 1 to 4, although, as I noted here in this frame, 4 through 19 form this nice chiasm that we'll go over next time. And so I'm going to be using this one line as part of this because it's the introductory section before Jacob and his family hear about what's going on. So to face that section, we need to look at a few issues. We're not going to look so much at source and strands. I did that in the introductory video, highlighting how older commentators like Westerman certainly see this as a compilation of different sources, but we don't need to be doing it that way. Today we'll look a little bit at the relationship with other rape stories, not so much the one in Judges 19, but the one in 2 Samuel 13, which is the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, which scholars often use as comparison. But my point of comparison more is going to be the David and Bathsheba situation, which we'll see begins almost exactly the same way as this one begins. And then in this initial scene, we have to be dealing with these two questions, number 4 and 5. We'll deal with number 6 next time. Is the initial acts, is Dinah's going out suspicious, and if so, by what standards? Is Shechem's taking of her suspicious, by what standards? Does it fit into the category that we would call rape, even though, as all scholars agree, there is no word in ancient Hebrew that exactly translates as rape? So we're going to have to look carefully at the combination of words that are behind the English here in the new RSV on the left side of the screen to see what's going on. But I want to highlight now that the question of whether it's rape or not is not the real question, because whether it is or not doesn't really matter. Shechem has taken this woman, and that's the issue, whether we call it rape or not. And then also this time we're going to look at the relationship between this story and portions of Exodus and Deuteronomy that, according to some scholars, provide a legal framework. But as Tuman notes, and you can see in my note down below on the left, from the writer's and narrator's point of view, Shechem's actions constituted a rape, but the proposals of every character were either impossible or unjust. Through deft engagement with the law, the writers of Genesis 34 damn every character. There are no heroes. There is no one for readers to applaud. The Shechem incident was a disaster from top to bottom. And that's part of my point, although Tuman doesn't draw the conclusion that I'm drawing here, which is that the reason for this lack of heroes is that once they got into the situation of settling near a violent city, there were no good options except to leave, which is what happens at the end. And so that's one of the things that we're going to see all along. Not that the characters should be applying the law, because plainly the characters in Genesis don't know Exodus or Deuteronomy, which according to the narrative take place later, even though in terms of which was written first, Exodus was certainly written first, and Deuteronomy was almost certainly written before exile, assuming that Genesis in the form we have it is from exile and the post-exilic Persian period afterward. So the authors and the audience would know Exodus and Deuteronomy, but certainly the characters don't. And what can we make of Dinah's silence and Leah's absence? Well, we'll look at those as we get into our scene here. So as we do, to look at the big picture, now that we've looked at this section, I want to highlight some of the key words in the shape that we're going to see. So plainly, daughter, daughter, daughter. The daughter of Leah is going out to see the daughters of the land, and we're going to see daughters and fathers all over the place. But we're going to see the relationship with family as well. So whether a daughter of Jacob or daughter of Leah, and then son of Hamor and other relationships like that, but to see the relationship between fathers and sons. We're also going to see a lot of giving and taking. It'll start with the taking we see in the first verse here. Just to situate ourselves on the maps we looked at last time, Shechem is up here. It means shoulder, and he's come from Sukkoth here. And this is in Israel. So now he's crossed over the Jordan. He's in the land of Israel, and he will continue in the land of Israel in Bethel. And of course, Jacob is now named Israel, even though he's called Jacob here. He'll be named Israel again in chapter 35 as we continue in this unit. So with the key words up, let's begin to enter in our scene. So notice the transition from the end of chapter 33, and I've been noting throughout this series and all my series, the chapters and verses are medieval constructions added to help copyists with their work. So the original text had no such markers, which is why things like chiasms are so helpful for allowing people to keep track of where they are, especially in the Hebrew original text that has no vowels and has no spaces between words and nothing what we call punctuation to help differentiate one sentence from another or a paragraph from another paragraph. So the chapters aren't there. So this is just the transition from he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel to now what happens right here. And Dinah, we've only seen in her birth notice, and she has no direct role here at all. She's taken, and we have no sense of her experience at all, which understandably leads feminist scholars and really anybody who's sympathetic to the victim here to wonder what is going on. Is it a function of the patriarchy of the text? Well, it's certainly a function of the patriarchy of the world inside the text, which ever since the Garden of Eden story has been shown to be the world of the curse. The world in the garden was not patriarchal. Male and female were equal according to God's original creation, but it's only this hierarchy that's been made in terms of patriarchy in the agricultural paradigm that exists outside the garden, as we saw in Genesis 3. So it's no surprise in this world that Dinah is subject to a patriarchal culture. But the fact that she doesn't speak isn't just a function of that, because as we've seen, Rachel speaks and Sarah speaks and Rebecca spoke, although her mother Leah does not speak other than to name the children. And so there are certain women whose voices are excluded, but it's not just a function of patriarchy. Perhaps here it's a function of Dinah and Leah being among the less favored members of Jacob's family. And we'll see on the other side of this in 35, where Rachel gives birth to her second son, Benjamin, and dies in childbirth, and the focus on that there. So we only see her here, and she's only going to be mentioned one more time, and that's in relation to the scene we're seeing here. So she's described as daughter of Leah here, although in verse 3 she'll be described as daughter of Jacob. So as daughter of Leah, she's named thusly here, and as we note below, daughter of Jacob 8 times in the story. She's one of only 2 people we can see in Genesis 36:39, daughter of Matra, the only other place in the entire Hebrew Bible where a mother's name is used for introducing a daughter. And where is Leah? Well, we have no idea at all, and she's not mentioned anywhere in the chapter. Neither is Rachel, for that matter, and it's not her child that's at issue. And Simeon and Levi are also Leah's daughter, or Leah's sons rather, but you think that with 3 of her children at issue, she might be somewhere in the scene, but she's not. And she was last mentioned as a live character in 33:7, and she'll only be mentioned again in her burial in 49:31. So those women are excluded here from the story. Whom she had borne to Jacob. Notice how much detail is being provided about Dinah, relatively speaking. Daughter of Leah, but she'd been born to Jacob. Who else would she have been born to, of course? Leah has only been married to Jacob, and it's not like she would have born a child to anybody else, but really highlighting that Jacob is her father, and so he has responsibility for what unfolds here. And it's all his responsibility, even though many commentators want to blame Simeon and Levi for the violence that they engage in afterward, but as I've been noting, it's all Jacob's fault for settling too soon and putting Dinah and his family in this dangerous situation. So she went out to visit the women of the region. And some older scholars, especially from a sexist perspective, want to blame her for that, for doing something that's risky and bold that she shouldn't be doing, as men have often done for blaming women for being bold and risky, for doing things that when men do, there's no criticism. So I just want to note the inherent sexism of scholarship until relatively recently. But if we look at the text itself, we can see this from my note below. No reason for this visit is narrated. There's no sense that the sons are going out to meet the people of the region. Maybe she's just boldly doing that first. Grammatically, it matches 30:16 when Leah went out, but Leah went out to see Jacob, not strangers. And the Midrash comments at the time, as you can see here from Genesis Rabbah, like mother like daughter, which means that she went out to meet him adorned like a harlot, which is a criticism of her from Genesis Rabbah's perspective, suggesting that she's partly at fault. But Sarna argues that the verb here, like its Akkadian Aramaic equivalents, can connote coquettish or promiscuous conduct, but compare the coming out of the men in verse 24. So that's one side of the story, but other sides suggest that she's simply going out boldly to visit, that she's a woman much perhaps like Mary in the New Testament, who goes out to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth, off in the distant country in Judea. She comes from Galilee, and nobody criticizes her for that, and she's obviously gone a much greater distance. We've seen here that Jacob has his tent pitched right there outside in the field outside of Shechem, actually inside Shechem. It's property he bought from the sons of Hamor. So she's not going very far. She's just going out to meet some women, as you could see in the beautiful photographic image from Diklo Lauer's Women of the Bible that I use as a cover image for this video here. So she's going out to visit the women not of the region, not women of the region, but the daughters of the land, Ha'eretz here, daughters of the land. And which is to say her peers. And you can only imagine what it's like for Dinah to be the one daughter in an army full of 11 men. And as Hepner notes below, I'll skip to this note to highlight his interesting note. And this is the kind of thing I just happen to love when scholars do word counting, because it reveals things that casual readers often miss. I did that a lot in the opening chapters of Genesis, where we noted the use of 7 times that words are used in multiples of 7 times. But here he notes how 11 times in the chapter and in the narrative, highlighting the number of sons. So let's look at that briefly. He notes that Hamor and Shechem are each mentioned 11 times in the chapter. Stone, the Hebrew Evan, is 11 times totally in the Jacob narrative. Paddan Aram, from whom Jacob came, and that we noted in the last scene, is 11 times in the Jacob narrative. And Jacob, at this point, like David, has 11 sons. His 12th son, Benjamin, as I noted, will be narrated the birth of him. His birth will be narrated in chapter 35. And circumcision, mentioned here, is used 11 times in Genesis 17. And so he goes on to conclude the 11-fold repetition of the word Hamor, meaning ass, and Shechem, which means shoulder, in the Dinah narrative highlights the way that Hamor and his son Shechem threatened to use intermarriage to make asses of the 11 sons of Jacob, while the 11-fold use of the verb meval, to circumcise, highlights the way that Dinah's brothers try to prevent this. And that's one way to interpret it. We don't have to see it that way. As we go through, we can make our own decision. But certainly all those 11s are not a coincidence, and that's just one of the ways that the Hebrew Bible authors pull things together to get us to look more deeply. So she's visiting the women of the earth here, the women of the land, and notice that's different than the field that Jacob's occupying, is the wider sense of things. So while she's on her way out, seemingly by herself, we don't know of any other women with her, although we will find out in chapter 35 that Rebekah's nurse Deborah's with them, and certainly Rachel and Leah are there, but we don't hear anything about that. So we hear this. And my note below, before we get to it, highlights this. After all the threatened but avoided violence between Jacob and Laban, which we certainly could have expected, it was certainly set up, or with Jacob and Esau, which Jacob certainly expected, and we as readers might well have expected, none of that happened. But now, suddenly out of nowhere, where no one is anticipating violence, there comes this shocking moment. My note continues, it recalls 6:1-2 with Shechem as a son of a god and the threat by the Sodomites against those visiting the city. He's not described that directly, but to the extent that local leaders are like divine people having the authority of whatever gods the Shechemites or the Hivites have here, although they're not named specifically. They're found and buried at the beginning of chapter 35, but no divinities are named there. We can also see it in connection with the story in 1 Samuel about what kings do. He took her, and that's what we see here, he took. Before we get to the take, let's look at a few more details. So Shechem, son of Havar, the Hivite. And interestingly, this is the only time in the passage this is mentioned. It's mentioned in the Table of Nations back in 10:17. It'll be mentioned one other time in the lineage of Esau in chapter 36. And many scholars who want to see Genesis as consonant with the demand in Deuteronomy 7 that when you enter into the land you must destroy all these people miss the point that Genesis is writing against Deuteronomy. It's writing an alternative view of Deuteronomy throughout, that the way to be with the people in the land, as we saw in chapter 23, was to buy some of it as a burial place for Sarah, or to negotiate distance, as we saw with Abraham and Lot separating in chapter 13, or just simply moving on, as we saw Abraham and Isaac do in the face of the wife-sister stories. But here, I would suggest if this was really about the ethnic issue, the intermarriage issue that is so important in the post-exilic message of texts like Ezra and Nehemiah, then this would be highlighted, but it's only mentioned here once. And as I noted already, the city is the theme that we'll see, not their particular ethnicity or the fact that they're not Israelites. So he's described as prince of the region, and prince is greatly misleading here. At least in my ears, prince sounds like son of the king in waiting, but it doesn't mean that at all. The word Nessi here literally means chief or simply leader. As my note below has, it's 126 times in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew language text, 61 times in Numbers and 36 in Ezekiel. So that's 97, 3/4 of them in those two texts. And almost always in ORSV translated as leader, a leader of your people. So it's not a king or a prince, it's just a vague word for a leader here. And what it literally suggests is that Shechem is the leader of the land here, Haaretz, matching the Haaretz up here, not his father. So not only is he not the son of the king lying in wait, like David's sons, Adonijah and Solomon, as we'll see in that story at the end of 2 Samuel, beginning of 1 Kings, it appears that he has the title of leader here. We saw that Abraham was seen as such in the eyes of the Hittites, and plainly he wasn't a king. We see that Ishmael's promised 12 of these as offspring, and it's often translated as chief. So it seems like he has the power in this region. And 3 verbs are described in quick succession: saw, took, and lay with. I'd like to note it here, as you see below, as we look at the comparison between his taking of Dinah and David's taking of Bathsheba. I went over a few of these last time, but I didn't include this there. The verbs are not exactly the same, but it's certainly a parallel sequence. In David's situation, he sent a messenger who took her, although the word took isn't used, and then lay with her. So saw, sent, and lay with. Here saw, took, and lay with. Certainly meant to be parallel. And if you didn't think of the Bathsheba story as a rape story, well, one would certainly want to ask then, well, how is it different than this one? And many scholars, including, interestingly, many feminist scholars, looking at the language more closely, don't see this as a rape story either. So let's look at the language ourselves and see more closely. So no question about saw there, and as far as we know, he is here by himself. There's no sense that he's got any kind of entourage. Seized her is simply took. Lakak, the word that's used over and over again in 1 Samuel 8 for what kings do. What we might look at here, though, is the passage from Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29, which at least is parallel, if not applicable. So from Deuteronomy, as you can see, we hear this: if a man meets a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her and lies with her, using the exact same language as here, and they are caught in the act, which is not what happens here, the man who lay with her shall give 50 shekels of silver to the young woman's father, and she shall become his wife. Because he violated her, he shall not be permitted to divorce her as long as he lives. We could also compare this passage from Exodus 22, which many scholars bring in. When a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if her father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. And so plainly what we see in those stories is that you can buy your way out of it with money. And I'd like to suggest that the Genesis authors are saying nonsense to that. The idea that you can take a person's daughter who, after you've taken her, is worth nothing to anybody in the culture of the time. She couldn't be married. It'd be a shame for her to be seen in public, and many women would not associate with her. That a small amount of money could somehow compensate for that is obviously absurd. I can't imagine quite what the Exodus or Deuteronomy authors were thinking, but certainly the Genesis authors seem to be seeing it from a different perspective. Many suggest that the taking is not a violent taking. As Van Wolde notes below, she says, the verb does not appear to be characterized by the idea of seize or of force of violence, which would be conveyed by the unpronounceable word there as chzq. Shechem takes her in the sense of transfers her to his own house, confirmed by verse 26, which is when her brothers take her back from their house. There the brothers of Dinah take her from Shechem's house and transfer her to their home. So she's suggesting that this is simply abduction and not rape. Is that less? It's interesting to me that some women scholars here seem to think that abducting somebody's daughter is somehow less violent than rape. I don't think she'd think that. I don't think the family would think that. And lay with her by force we'll have to deal with. The verb for lay with here is one of several verbs for sexual intercourse in the Hebrew Bible, and one of the more crude ones. The more polite one in the sense of intimacy is nu, yada, and that's what we see in the Garden of Eden, that the Adam knew his wife, his woman, and she bore a child. And so nu is more like what we might say like make love, something that involves an intimacy and care and concern for one another. A middle level one could be like he slept with her, went into her. That's much like what we say, something neutral like slept with. But lay with here is much like he laid her. It's crude. It's not quite like he effed her, as we might say in colloquial English, but it's certainly a cruder sense. And this is the final element we have to pay attention to. In the PL form, it literally means to abuse. And it simply does not mean rape, and it doesn't necessarily mean by force either, as the notes below highlight. So let's look at that more closely. We can see it was used earlier of the Egyptians to the Israelites, anticipating what would happen. That's in the scene where Abraham has the vision from God of what his descendants would experience in Egypt. So certainly that's not rape. What Sarah did to Hagar, which is usually translated as oppress there, and that's certainly not rape. The covenant between Jacob and Laban regarding the daughters, and that certainly wasn't rape. And so in the Septuagint, it's translated by a word that means he humbled her. And Van Wolde notes the use of the verb in the PL with a woman as object in these few places, which I noted above, and she suggests it should be translated as debased and not as rape. Similarly, Lynn Bechtel, whose work I use here around the question of seeing this as a group experience rather than an individual experience, as I did also in chapter 19, notes the meaning of to put down as part of the shaming process and highlights it's about social shame. And so that's why I translated it in its multiple uses here as defiled, as you can see in a number of places. So the issue isn't that he raped her, that he defiled her, but it has the same effect. She is now no longer able to raise her head, and she certainly couldn't marry anybody else. And in fact, he's got control of her as this scene unfolds. So let's just continue a little bit here to see how it seems to shift. As Sternberg notes below, the three verbs of forcing give way to three verbs of endearment. And he adds, the narrator first shocks us by the suddenness of what he calls the rape, and only then proceeds to its after effects on the rapist. Soul, as always in the Hebrew scripture, is simply wrong. The word nephesh here means their center, their being. There is no concept of soul in the Israelite cultural context here. So as I translated here, his being, his essence, his heart, if you will, was drawn to her. But the word for drawn here, navak, is the word for clinging to your woman in the Garden of Eden story, before patriarchy settles in. So there it was a very positive word, and this is certainly the contrast with what we see with the situation with Tamar and Amnon, where Amnon is said to love her and debase her using the same word a little farther on, but then he hates her and despises her and throws her out. So great contrast there with what we see with Shechem here. I notice she's described as daughter of Jacob here, as I noted, not daughter of Leah, and he loved her. And we have to pay close attention to that. The risk of going a little long, I think it's really important that we hear this here, because the English word love has almost nothing to do with what the Hebrew ahav means here. As Van Wolde notes below, in all narrative contexts in which the word hav occurs in the relationship between man and woman, the verb is in the third person masculine singular, the only exception being Mishal for David in 1 Samuel, and in the Song of Songs, which is exceptional precisely for its equality. Its meaning thus is, quote, the emotion, attitude, and behavior of a man toward a woman. And as Suzanne Schultz notes, in the context of rape, the verb does not refer to mutual intimacy. Rather, it indicates the meaning to desire in the sense of to lust after. And we could certainly hear that because we heard that was the word described for the food that Isaac loved, that his son, Harry's hunter's son Esau, made for him. So in that sense, it's certainly desire, not love. So we can certainly hear the desire for her, but here described as na'ara, a girl, and here is a yeladah, which is even more pejorative, or diminutive, I guess, is the more precise word, not pejorative. The only other person named as a narar is Rebecca back in chapter 24 when Abraham's servant was sent to get her, and in the context of Deuteronomy 22 that we just looked at. And he spoke tenderly to her, literally to her heart, a phrase that will occur one more time in Genesis and a few other times. Interestingly, in the aftermath of the Absalom story, where David is told to speak to the heart of the soldiers before he loses them. As Schultz notes again here, in the context of fear and anxiety, sin or offense, when someone is trying to change someone else's negative opinion. Hence, she suggests he attempted to soothe the young woman. As the medieval commentator Rashi notes, look at your father. For a small plot of land, how much he had to overpay. I will marry you and you own the whole city and its fields. And as Carolyn Blythe notes below, less a sense of his concern and affection for Dinah than his egotistical and self-serving efforts to mollify and thus maintain possession of the woman who had been a casualty of his violent sexual assault. Wow. Well, there's a range of possibilities. And so just to complete our time for today, it continues. We hear nothing about Dinah. We don't know where she is. We know Shechem had to leave the scene and go speak to his father. Did he just leave her out in the field, or is she in his house? None of that's told here. We won't look at the chiasm now. We'll look at that next time. So Shechem spoke to his father saying, get me, or literally, take me this girl, highlighting the take again. Yeladah is only two other times in Joel 3:3 and in Zechariah, elsewhere in the Masoretic text. As Hepner notes, it implies his recognition of the fact that after he is lain with Dinah, she is no longer a Betula, a virgin. And that's a situation we have to face, as horrible and as shocking and as suddenly as it all happens. And what will happen in the aftermath when Jacob hears about this, we'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.